Let's talk about this piece I saw published on the Wall Street Journal. And yeah, am I talking about tariffs again? Yes.
Well, excuse me, princess.
Because I think there's some telling stuff in this article written by Orrin Cass, who is the director of the American Compass and the author of The Once and Future Worker. This was published on October 27th, titled Why Trump is Right About Tariffs. Taxing imported goods is unpopular with economists, but it could help the United States lower the trade deficit, strengthen its industrial base, and safeguard national security. So already they're flirting with the whole economics and national security Mott and Bailey that I talked about a few months ago. I also think it's interesting that no one ever gives President Biden credits for doubling down on Trump's ridiculous Buy American trade policy. This has been reported in a variety of different articles, but we don't see it from people like Orrin Cass or anyone on the populist right, really. None of the MAGAs seem to want to give Biden any credit for doubling down. This is like the one of the few areas maybe, that President Joe Biden and former President Trump agree on. Policies that have resulted in increased costs for U.S. infrastructure and delayed the construction of infrastructure projects here in America. No big deal or anything. Economists have reacted poorly to Donald Trump's recent proposal for a 10% tariff on all imports. On all imports, 10% tax, just in case anyone is still operating on this notion that all this talk about trade restrictions and tariffs is all about China.
Blow it out your ass.
And then it goes on to say, but why? After all, tax revenue is necessary to provide public services, and tariffs have long proved an effective way to collect it. In 1789, the first law in the first Congress, advocated by Alexander Hamilton, introduced by James Madison, and signed by George Washington on the 4th of July, established a tariff not unlike Trump's. For much of the nation's history, while growing from a colonial backwater to continent-spanning industrial colossus, the U.S. imposed some of the world's highest tariffs, which were the primary means of funding the federal government. Now, there are a few reasons why I think this emphasis on raising revenue is a red herring, a bit disingenuous. First off, the initial import tax in 1789 was considered a compromise, with advocates like James Madison demanding it principally as a source of revenue for the government and not as a means of protecting industry. At least according to this one source published in 1976 by John M. Dobson, 2 Centuries of Tariffs, published by the U.S. International Trade Commission, talks about how the need for revenue was crucial. James Madison was selected as the nation's first Speaker of the House, the people's representative body specifically delegated to originate all revenue bills. He immediately introduced a revenue tariff measure designed to raise money to pay government wages and obligations to fund the national debt. This initial tariff bill became law on July 4th, 1789, and it contained many of the characteristics found in later tariff acts. Going on to say, despite Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton's enthusiastic advocacy of protective tariffs, the nation as a whole exhibited little interest in using high tariffs to stimulate manufacturing at home. The eloquent arguments Hamilton marshaled were generally neglected during his lifetime, but they would be revived and used effectively by later advocates of tariff protection. So yeah, it looks like this initial tariff was meant to just raise revenue. And while I'm personally opposed to taxes, I will say that I'm willing to tolerate tariffs if if its function is to finance the government's ability to protect international trade. I think it makes sense that if you import goods from other countries, that you pay a duty for the services rendered. The services being the protection of your shipment from pirates and other hostile actors. I think another reason why this emphasis over revenue is a bit disingenuous is because back in the early days of the Republic, the government required a much smaller budget, mainly due to the fact that there was not a massive welfare state during these days. And notice how the current modern system is just taken as a given, not questioned. Talking about how we need to raise revenue. It looks like in 2022, the federal government raised $4.9 trillion in revenue, much of which came from individual income taxes, payroll taxes, and corporate income taxes. And even with all that, there was still a $1.4 trillion deficit. And according to some sources, we might be facing a $2 trillion deficit in the year 2023. I think it's usually a telltale sign of a statist or some wannabe economic planner that they never, when it comes to raising revenue or balancing the budget, they never consider cutting spending, but rather tax. But whether it's 1.4 trillion or 2 trillion that we got to make up for, that we got to find more money for, it looks like the amount of money that we currently get from import taxes, I think it peaked in 2022 at $111 billion. You would need to increase that by 14 to 20 times to break even in 1 year, which I think is far more than a mere 10% tariff. On top of all of this, he goes on to say, tariffs are distinctive as a source of revenue because they tilt the market away from imports and toward domestic production. And I'm over here wondering, well, do you want tariffs as a source of revenue, or do you want to pressure Americans to buy American? Because you cannot have it both ways here. If you like it as a source of revenue, that means you think that it's good that Americans import from other countries because then you can raise revenue. Otherwise, you want them to import less as a means of protecting domestic production. That means you get less revenue if Americans turn away from importing goods. It's like what we see with sin taxes on stuff like tobacco and soda. The taxes are imposed explicitly to drive up costs for these goods in an effort to discourage people from consuming tobacco and soda. But now imagine a tobacco tax advocate saying that the reason why tobacco taxes are good is because the revenue that's been collected has now afforded the government to do wonderful things like, say, provide every public school student with a free lunch every day. At that point, you're saying that it's good that people smoke cigarettes because cigarette smokers are essentially feeding hungry students, when the whole purpose of the original tax was to discourage people from smoking. You cannot have it both ways here. I also want to address this part. For much of the nation's history, while growing from colonial backwater to continent-spanning industrial colossus, the U.S. imposed some of the world's highest tariffs, which were the primary means of funding the federal government. That doesn't mean that tariffs are good. You know where I see a lot of this mentality is whenever Gavin Newsom or Democrat cheerleaders, whenever they want to hold up California as being the fourth largest economy or whatever, they often do so to say, see, Democrat economic policies like intense regulations and high taxes. So it looks like it's not that damaging after all.
Blow it out your ass.
Similar mentality here. Hey, we had high tariffs, and during this period, the U.S. went from a colonial backwater to a industrial colossus. This also does not mention the fact that tariffs were not always high, and when they were not high, it was good for American industry, and when they were high, it crippled American industry. At least according to two different Burton Folsom books, Myth of the Robber Barons and New Deal or Raw Deal. In Myth of the Robber Barons, Folsom mentions how the Scrantons, the steel-producing family in Pennsylvania, they excelled during a time of low tariffs. The book even talks about at one point how farmers in the area benefited from the Scranton success due to selling their land because of its increased value. And in New Deal or Raw Deal, Folsom mentions how the Smoot-Hawley tariff made it more expensive for auto manufacturers to produce cars because they relied heavily on imported goods to produce cars. And I think this is where it's really telling. Tariffs are distinctive as a source of revenue because they tilt the market away from imports and toward domestic production. Whether that's desirable or disastrous hinges on a series of questions that go to the heart of economic thinking. Does making things matter? Do a nation and its economy require a strong industrial base? Why is the nation the focus here? Is a persistent trade deficit a problem? Common sense,
blow it out your ass,
historical precedent, and a great deal of economic logic and research suggest that the answer to these questions is yes. Domestic production has value to a nation. Domestic production has value to a nation. Notice the emphasis on collectivism here. It's all about what's best for the nation. Domestic production has value to a nation, so a tariff that gives it preferential treatment can be sensible and even, to use the economist's favorite term, efficient. Large, persistent trade deficits are bad for America, which means a tax on imports can help. So a trade deficit is when a country imports more than it exports. That's it. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I would say that it's not inherently a bad thing, but in all fairness, it can be a sign of bad economic policy. Like during the Great Depression, the United States temporarily became a net importer of food, partly because President Franklin Delano Roosevelt reduced tariffs to his credit. On the other hand, FDR also imposed price floors on food as a kickback to American farmers, which caused shortages on the domestic front and domestic food prices to increase, making imports more competitive. And I've talked before about how protectionist policies like the Jones Act have resulted in Americans importing more oil and crippling Americans' ability to do business in states like Hawaii and Alaska. So if anything, it's often bad economic policies, some of which are protectionist, that result in these dastardly trade deficits. Then there's the fact that the trade deficit has only gotten worse by Cass's standards since the reemergence of protectionism by both Trump and Biden. So I'm not so sure that tariffs, that taxes on imports will help on that front, as Mr. Cass insists. And then later on in this piece, Mr. Cass talks about how this has impacted manufacturing, the trade deficit, saying, but the situation today is very different. In 2023, the U.S. will run a $1 trillion trade deficit, representing $1 trillion worth of foreign goods consumed here, bought not with some part of the produce of our own industry, but instead by selling U.S. assets such as treasury bonds, corporate debt, and equity, and real estate. In effect, America consumes on credit while giving away ownership of the U.S. economy and future claims on its output. The imbalance is doubly damaging. First, the industrial base stagnates as imports reduce demand for output without exports creating an offsetting increase. Whereas real manufacturing output doubled from 1980 to 2000, it rose only 7% from 2000 to 2020. As a result, after holding steady for 50 years, manufacturing employment collapsed by 1/3, eliminating more than 4 million jobs. Automation is not the story here. To the contrary, manufacturing productivity has declined over the past decade, a shocking trend incompatible with a well-functioning capitalist system. So I guess it's all capitalism's fault, leaving the sector far less competitive. And I'm guessing he's relying on these numbers. This is a number from the Federal Reserve of Education, St. Louis. because it kind of lines up with his numbers, talking about from 1980 to 2000. It doubled, but only rose 7% from 2000 to 2020. Interesting that after NAFTA, that manufacturing did not fall off a cliff. I think it's also interesting that he selects these two out while leaving out the fact that manufacturing output took a massive hit, seemingly as a result of the financial crisis of 2008, as we can see here, before stagnating between 2015 and around 2023, around now, roughly around the same time that Trump and Biden's Buy American policies kicked in. And of course, he blames all of this for the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs, when in fact it's trade restrictions and Buy American policies that have costed Americans millions of jobs over the years. This all ignores the fact that countries don't technically trade. Individuals in countries trade with one another. If I were to buy a new automobile imported from South Korea, or a new video game console imported from Japan, or even something small like avocados imported from Mexico, if I were to do all that without exporting some goods back to those countries, guess what? I'm causing a trade deficit.
Well, excuse me, princess.
But I guess what matters at the end of the day to Orin cast types is not my values, not my interests, but what values are to a nation, the interest of the nation. Domestic production has value to a nation. Again, ignores the fact that domestic producers rely on imports, and that taxing said imports cripples their ability to produce and thrive and grow. But what about me? What about my values? What if imported goods have value to me and my life? I guess I gotta pay more for those goods and services that I might want to import. It's almost as if it's collectivists that see individuals as mere cogs in a machine whose purpose is to serve some semblance of a greater good.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
And those who do not ought to be punished. In this case, they'll be punished via higher import taxes.